Well, back on our program this morning is Ebru Today's consultant, Dr. Yohuru Williams, professor of African American history at Fairfield University. And he's here to talk about politicians' religious backgrounds and the effects their belief have among voters. What are the polls telling us about this president?
Well, the most recent poll that was conducted in Alabama and Mississippi had some pretty startling results. 45% of those responding in Alabama believed that President Obama was a Muslim, and 52% in Mississippi believed that Obama was a Muslim, contrary to Obama's professed Christianity. So this has been pretty startling and amazing, quite frankly, given everything the president has done to correct that misconception about his religious belief.
Now, do the polls measure the education level of people that believe these things? I mean, this has been debunked over and over and over.
Absolutely, Brian. And what's so amazing about this is when this story broke 24 hours ago, the real focus was on these numbers. When we started to look a little bit more deeply at the questions that were asked to these respondents, it really showed some bias here that actually are now calling into question this poll. There were three questions in particular, one on President Obama's religion, the second on whether Mississippians and Alabamans believed in interracial marriage, and the third, a question on evolution. And the group that conducted these surveys, which is out of North Carolina, only asked a question about interracial marriage in one other state, South Carolina. So they haven't asked these questions anyplace else. So the question now becomes, was this deliberately done to show some type of bias on the part of these, voters in these two states? And and if so, to what end?
Now that you mention that, and we look at how this was kind of skewed or just not maybe handled exactly how we would think, how do we interpret the results, knowing what you just said?
Well, it's going to be very interesting, Lucy, because I think now people are asking the questions legitimately, what was the intent of this poll? And if the intent was to stir up animosity, maybe engender some type of political backlash in that region, it certainly had that effect. This is unfortunately not healthy for political discourse in this country because we're already polarized over a number of issues. And it brings up some old bugaboos which don't really continue to haunt us about our history. The history of the Civil War, obviously, and racial segregation, in which Alabama and Mississippi were bastions. So again, these are questions that, if this is what the pollsters were going for, very troubling.
Well, of course, race is the elephant in the room that no one talks about with respect to President Obama. He's undergone more disrespect in the presidency than any president ever, but we don't talk about that. But let's talk about the whole religious aspect. He's not the first president to be challenged on his religious background.
No, very true. And we've seen this historically in a number of instances. JFK is probably the most recent, where you have a person who's a Catholic, and there were certainly concerns that JFK, because of his Catholicism, that would present some type of issue in terms of him being president. And so he came out in Dallas, gave a speech, which Mitt Romney in 2008 memorably went back to Dallas to try to recreate that historical moment and to say, I as a Mormon, like JFK as a Catholic, am going to hold the Constitution of the United States first in the highest esteem, highest regard.
Who is he speaking to in Dallas?
JFK was speaking to the Democrats, the Democratic Party, and saying, or actually to the American people, and saying, no, there's no problem here with regard to my religion.
Right, we're cool.
Right, exactly. The interesting thing about Obama is not a Muslim. And so the problem that's presented by this is that he's actually being confronted with something that's not true. Al Smith, who ran for governor, or was governor of New York, ran for president in the 1920s, 1928, underwent tremendous scrutiny because of his Catholicism. And he had to fight the allegations that he was a papist and he would owe allegiance to the Pope and not to the Constitution. This is not an analogous situation because this is simply not true about Obama. He's not. He's been very clear about that. There's been full disclosure. And like the birther movement, I think it's problematic because it calls into question, where is this coming from? And is race a factor here when you talk about the other reasons why people have to feel uncomfortable with Obama as president?
Well, I think the whole thing originated with just his name. Barack Obama. People assumed, okay, that's it, and then Barack Hussein Obama, that made it worse. And then you've got the connection with his father to Kenya. So, a lot of people who might have drawn some unfair relationships there had something to go on.
I think so. And part of the problem there also emanates from the fact that Obama himself really at least initially, didn't come out as forcefully as he might have to dispel some of those. I think he just assumed that this was something that would go away. By the time he answered it in the same way that he did with regard to his birth certificate, it had already taken on a life of its own. And I think it's created a really polarized, at least in some circles, discourse about the president, which is very unfair to him. We're not evaluating his policies. We're still talking about issues that are tangential to his performance as president.
Now, what about Minnesota Congressman Keith Ellison? Now, he is a Muslim, so how does that work out for him when you hear all of these different things going on?
What's most troubling for me, Lucy, is that what this seems to indicate, and this does not bode well for the United States in terms of our international reputation, is Islamophobia on the part of Americans. And in a nation that values pluralism, where we talk about the importance of being a melting pot, this is something that doesn't reflect well on us. Obama complained about the saber rattling among Republican candidates in recent weeks. I think we have to be also concerned about what this says to the international community when this continues to be an issue, and we're playing up the notion that certain segments of the country might be uncomfortable with someone because of their faith.
But you have to wonder, too, like in an election year, that they're kind of seemingly skewing this poll and putting it out. So that kind of brings questions in, too,
Absolutely. And I think, again, because of the Mississippi and Alabama Republican caucus and primaries are tonight, certainly this is the reason why this is coming out now. And again, the timing of it, the questions themselves, the fact that you got a question on evolution, a question on interracial marriage, very, very troubling.
Right. And we saw it during the campaign in 2008, where the president was criticized for his connection with the whole Reverend Wright thing, when he was talking about the historicalness of the relationship between African Americans in America, versus McCain and his a minister who had made some anti-Semitic remarks, but he didn't get pilloried for that like the president did.
Or play. I mean, certainly not nearly as much play in the news media.
Exactly.
And the pundits.
Absolutely. And I think it speaks to what Richard Hofstadter talked about in his book, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, that sometimes these are the conversations we're most comfortable with. They're not necessarily productive in terms of advancing, our political system, but it's where people feel comfortable. And it's what produces, unfortunately, what we saw in Arizona last year, a situation where Congressman Gabby Giffords is shot because you create a polarizing political climate. People are not focusing on the issues, they're focusing on personality, other issues, not good.
And misconceptions in many cases, as we're seeing with our own president. Well, this discussion certainly continues, and thank you so much for coming back. We know you will be back again.
Always great to see you guys. Thank you.
You too.